greatest triumph of civilization is often seen as our mastery of heat. Yet our conquest of coal is an equally epic journey, from dark beginnings to an ultra-cool frontier. For centuries, cold remained a perplexing mystery. Nobody had any idea what it was, much less how to harness its effects. Yet in the last 100 years, cold has transformed the way we live and work. Imagine homes or supermarkets without fridges and frozen foods, or skyscrapers without air conditioning, or hospitals without liquid oxygen. We take for granted the technology of cold, yet it has enabled us to explore outer space and the inner depths of our brain. And as we develop new ultra-cold technology to create quantum computers and high-speed networks, it may even change the way we think and interact. This is the story of how scientists and dreamers over the past 4 centuries plunged lower and lower down the temperature scale to conquer the cold, enrich our lives, and attempt to reach the ultimate limit of cold, a holy grail as elusive as the speed limit of light, absolute zero. Extreme cold has always held a special place in our imagination. For thousands of years, it seemed like a malevolent force associated with death and darkness. Cold was an unexplained phenomenon. Was it a substance, a process, or some special state of being? Back in the 17th century, no one knew, but they certainly felt its effects in the freezing London winters.
17th century England was in the middle of what's now called the Little Ice Age. It was fantastically cold by modern standards. You have to imagine a world lit by fire in which most people are cold most of the time. Cold would have felt like a real presence, a kind of positive agent that was affecting how people felt. And that fitted nicely with the most orthodox received view that natural philosophers had inherited from the Greeks, from Aristotle, hundreds of years earlier, that there are 2 agents in the world, hot and cold. They function symmetrically. They can combine or separate.
Back then, people felt at the mercy of cold. This was a time when such natural forces were viewed with awe as acts of God. So anyone attempting to tamper with cold did so at their peril. The first to try was an alchemist, Cornelis Drebbel. On a hot summer's day in 1620, King James I and his entourage arrived to experience an unearthly event. Drebbel, who was also the court magician, had a wager with the king that he could turn summer into winter. He would attempt to chill the air in the largest interior space in the British Isles, the Great Hall of Westminster. Drebbel hoped to shake the king to his core.
He had a phenomenally fertile mind. He was an inventor par excellence. His whole world was steeped in a world of alchemy, of perpetual motion machines, of the idea of time, space, planets, moon, sun, gods. He was a fervently religious man. He was a person for whom nature presented a a galaxy of possibilities.
Dr. Andrew Shidlow, a chemist with a lifelong fascination for Drebbel, enjoys his reincarnation as the great court magician. Like most alchemists, Drebbel kept his method secret. Dr. Shidlow wants to test his ideas on how Drebbel created artificial cold.
When Drebel was trying to achieve the lowest temperature possible. He knew that ice, of course, was the freezing point, the coldest you could get normally. But he would have been aware of the fact, through his experience, that mixing ice with different salts could get you a colder temperature.
Salts will lower the temperature at which ice melts. Dr. Shidlow thinks Drebel probably used common table salt, which gives the biggest temperature drop. But salt and ice alone would not be enough to cool down such a large interior. Drebel was famous for designing elaborate contraptions, a passion shared by Dr. Shidlow, who has an idea for the alchemist's machine.
So here we would have had a fan which would have been turned over, blowing warm air over the cold vessels there. And as the air blows over these cold jars, we would have had, in effect, the world's first air conditioning unit.
But could this really turn summer into winter?
The idea is to stir it in as well as possible in the 5 seconds that you have to do it.
Dr. Shidlow stacks the jars of freezing mixture to create cold corridors for the air to pass through.
We can feel it's very cold. In fact, I could feel cold air actually falling on my hands, because cold air, of course, is denser than warm air, and one can feel it quite clearly on the fingers.
The vital question: would the gust of warm air become cold?
Woof, I can feel certainly a blast of cold air hitting me as that second cover was released. Well, temperature, we're on 14 at the moment. Yes, keep it going, that's definitely the right direction. I think possibly even closer still will give us a better effect, there's no doubt.
So how would the king have reacted to his encounter with man-made cold?
He would have been shocked, he wouldn't have known what's happening. He could have in fact been wondering whether there's some action of gods or some sort of forces, demonological forces which were in action, and he would have left hastily, freezing as he did so.
Had Drebel written up his great stunt, he might have gone down in history as the inventor of air conditioning. Yet it would be almost 3 centuries before this idea eventually took off. To advance knowledge and conquer the cold required men with a very different mindset. King James's Lord Chancellor, Francis Bacon, was the first to apply the scientific method to the study of heat and cold. He believed it was important to conduct experiments and analyze the results, rather than rely on the established wisdom of the ancients.
For Francis Bacon, heat and cold turn out to be right at the centre of his worldview. One way of understanding why that's so is think why heat and cold matter to human beings. They really matter in the 17th century for 2 reasons. One is the weather and one is disease. There was, after all, an obvious tension in everyday experience between the healthy effects of warmth and the healthy effects of cold. Warmth made you healthy because it stopped you radiating away the vital spirits within you. But cold obviously had crucial effects against death as well. It could preserve things for immensely long times, and maybe it could preserve Francis Bacon's body too.
Bacon rarely carried out experiments himself, but his one foray into the preservative effects of the cold had disastrous consequences. He took a freshly killed chicken and stuffed it full of ice and snow to investigate how much longer the chicken meat might stay fresh. He was impressed by the results. The chicken did remain fresh for many days. Unfortunately, during the process of exposing his own body to the cold, he caught pneumonia. As Bacon lay dying, it dawned on him that his fascination with the cold was going to cost him his life.
The irony, tragedy of that rather sad experiment didn't dissuade his followers from doing more experiments on ice and snow and its vital or preservative effects. The men who followed Bacon were really convinced that if we could understand the way in which motion, cold and heat fitted together, we could save ourselves from disease, we could unlock the mysteries of the universe.
This fundamental question, what is cold, haunted Robert Boyle, who was born the year after Bacon died. The son of the Earl of Cork, a wealthy nobleman, Boyle used his fortune to build an extensive laboratory. Boyle is famous for his experiments on the nature of air, but he also became the first master of cold. Believing it to be an important but neglected subject, he carried out hundreds of experiments.
He worked through, very systematically, a series of ideas about what cold is. Does it come from the air? Does it come from the absence of light? Is it that there are strange, so-called frigorific, cold-making particles? The dominant view, certainly in Boyle's lifetime, the view that he set out to attack, is that cold is a primordial substance. That when bodies get colder, they're sucking in this primordial cold, and as they get warmer, they expel it. Boyle thought that was wrong, and he did experiments to show that it was wrong.
Boyle was curious about the way water expanded when it turned to ice. He wondered whether the increase in volume was accompanied by an increase in weight. They carefully weighed a barrel of water and took it outside in the snow, leaving it to freeze overnight. Boyle reasoned that if once the water turned to ice, the barrel weighed more, then perhaps cold was a substance after all. But when they reweighed the barrel, they discovered it weighed exactly the same.
So what must be happening, Boyle guessed, was that the particles of water were moving further apart. And that was the expansion, not some substance flowing into the barrel from outside.
Boyle was becoming increasingly convinced that cold was not a substance, but something that was happening to the particles, and began to think back to his earlier experiments with his air pump.
Boyle's idea was that the air trapped in this glass container is springy, it's elastic. As you try and compress it, it resists. Now, this is very closely linked in Boyle's program to the way he studies heat and cold, because his idea was that as substances like the air get warmer, they tend to expand. It's as though the little particles, little springs, out of which he imagined each air particle is made, are gradually unwinding, so they take up more space and they expand. Boyle's conclusion here was that heat is a form of motion of a particular kind, and that as bodies cool down, they move less and less.
Boyle's longest published book was on the cold, yet he found its study troublesome and full of hardships, declaring that he felt like a physician trying to work in a remote country without the benefit of instruments or medicines. To properly explore this country of the cold, Boyle lamented the lack of a vital tool, an accurate thermometer. It was not until the mid-17th century that glassblowers in Florence began to produce accurately calibrated thermometers.